I grew up watching love come with receipts, and somehow my name was never on them. While my parents erased my brother's debts and bought him everything he wanted, I learned how to survive without help, until the day I stopped accepting crumbs and took back something money could never be you. My name is Emerson, and I learned early that generosity in my family had rules I was never invited to discuss. At dinner my mother would say, "Jake needs help again," and my father would nod before I finished chewing. Jake leaned back and said, "It's temporary," and my parents believed him without questions. I listened while they talked about loans, gifts, fixes, and solutions, and nobody asked how I was doing. When I mentioned needing help with rent, my mother said, "You're so independent," like independence solved bills. My father added, "You always land on your feet," and I wondered when that became an excuse. Jake laughed and said, "You've got this," and my parents smiled like encouragement was enough. I remembered being a kid and hearing, "Jake just needs support," while I learned to handle things quietly. When Jake failed, it was called bad luck. When I struggled, it was called a lesson. At family gatherings my parents bragged about what they bought Jake, and I nodded politely. If someone asked about me, my mother said, "Emerson is doing fine," and changed the subject. I asked once, "Why does he get help every time?" and my father said, "Don't keep score." But the score was everywhere. Bills on my counter. Money in Jake's pocket. Silence around my needs. Maya noticed before I admitted it and whispered, "This isn't fair," and I said, "It's normal." She looked at me and said, "Only because you let it be." At dinner Jake said, "They're helping me again," and my parents smiled like proud sponsors. I said nothing, because speaking up made the room tense. My mother said, "You're low maintenance," and I realized that meant invisible. My father said, "We don't worry about you," and I thought worry might have felt like care. Jake asked for money casually, and my parents reached for their wallets without hesitation. I asked for advice once, and my mother said, "You'll figure it out." That sentence followed me everywhere. I worked more hours, skipped things I needed, and told myself this was temporary. Jake quit another job, and my parents said, "He's finding himself." I asked, "What am I finding?" and my father said, "Strength." Strength felt heavy. At holidays my parents bought Jake expensive gifts and said, "He's been through a lot." They handed me something practical and said, "You don't need much." I smiled because I always did. I learned how to minimize my wants to keep the peace. Maya said, "You're allowed to ask," and I replied, "I already know the answer." When I finally asked directly for help, my mother frowned and said, "You should plan better." Jake said, "Don't stress," and my father said, "You're doing great," and nothing changed. I felt something crack quietly inside me. I wasn't jealous. I was tired. Tired of being the responsible one. Tired of being praised instead of supported. Tired of watching money erase his mistakes while mine piled up. I asked my father, "Do you think this is fair?" and he said, "Life isn't fair." That was the moment I understood fairness was not the goal. Comfort was. And Jake owned it. I lay awake counting expenses while Jake slept knowing rescue was guaranteed. I stopped asking questions because answers hurt more than silence. Maya held my hand and said, "They expect you to carry more," and I nodded. I watched my parents justify favoritism with calm certainty. They weren't confused. They were choosing. That truth landed hard. My struggle wasn't unseen. It was expected. I wasn't failing. I was filling a role. The strong one. The quiet one. The one who didn't cost extra. When I looked at my parents, I stopped hoping they would notice. I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. My name was always said second. And nothing about that was accidental. The first bank alert that morning said my account was overdrawn, and the second message was my mother saying they had paid Jake's credit card again. I stared at my phone and laughed once, not because it was funny, but because something in me was breaking cleanly. I called my mother and said, "I'm short on rent," and she replied, "Have you tried cutting back?" Like cutting back could erase math. My father added on speaker, "Jake had an emergency," and I asked, "What about mine?" and the line went quiet. Jake walked into the kitchen and said, "It's just money," and my parents nodded like that explained everything. I said, "It's not just money to me," and my mother answered, "You stress too much." That sentence followed me everywhere. At dinner they discussed wiring funds, covering interest, and buying Jake a new phone so he could stay motivated. I listened while my stomach twisted and my plate stayed full. When I mentioned a medical bill, my father said, "You'll figure it out," and Jake said, "You're tough." I didn't want to be tough. I wanted help. Later I overheard my parents on the phone saying, "He's learning," while I folded laundry and counted quarters. A notification buzzed and reminded me another payment was due, and I felt my chest tighten. I remembered being 12 and hearing, "Jake needs extra support," while I learned to do without asking. I remembered being 17 and hearing, "You're so responsible," while Jake crashed another car. Responsibility had never come with reward. Only expectation. I asked my father one night, "Why does he always get help?" and he said, "Because he needs it more." I asked, "What do I need?" and he said, "Perspective." That hurt more than no. Maya came over and said, "You look exhausted," and I replied, "I'm always tired." She asked, "Did they help him again?" and I nodded. She said, "What about you?" and I said, "I didn't ask." She looked at me and said, "You shouldn't have to." At the next dinner Jake joked about bad luck, and my parents laughed. I said, "I'm behind again," and my mother said, "We can't keep bailing everyone out." I stared at her and asked, "Who is everyone?" She didn't answer. My father said, "This isn't a competition," and I replied, "Then stop choosing sides." Jake rolled his eyes and said, "You're dramatic," and my parents let it slide. I felt invisible and loud at the same time. I asked once, carefully, "Can you help me this month?" and my mother said, "If we help you, you won't learn." I asked, "What did he learn?" and my father said, "Enough." That was my breaking point. I went home and cried on the floor until my throat hurt. Maya stayed on the phone and said, "They sold you strength because it cost them nothing." I whispered, "I don't want to be strong anymore," and she said, "Then stop carrying this alone." Jake texted, "They've got me covered," and I didn't respond. My parents called later and said, "We trust you," like trust was a substitute for care. I realized then that independence was never a compliment. It was an assignment. They bought him comfort with money and attention. They sold me strength with silence and expectation. I looked around my small apartment and felt something shift. This wasn't temporary. It was structural. I wasn't unlucky. I was designated. The strong one. The one who didn't ask. The one who managed. The one who absorbed imbalance quietly. That night I stopped hoping they would change. I stopped explaining my needs. I stopped pretending this was normal. I understood something painful and freeing at the same time. Independence was never my choice. It was the role they assigned me. And roles could be rejected. The conversation that ended it all started like every other one, calm on the surface and exhausting underneath. My father said, "Jake needs help again," and I felt nothing instead of anger. I asked, "What kind of help?" and my mother replied, like details were unnecessary. Jake said, "It's not a big deal," and my parents nodded before I could speak. I said, "It's always a big deal to me," and my father answered, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I looked at him and said, "It's been hard the whole time." My mother said, "Why are you doing this now?" and I replied, "Because I'm done pretending." Jake laughed and said, "You're really holding on to this," and I answered, "I've been carrying it." My father said, "We raised you to be strong," and I replied, "You raised me to manage without help." My mother sighed and said, "You don't understand our position," and I said, "You never tried to understand mine." The room went quiet, and for once I didn't rush to fix it. Jake said, "So what, you're just giving up?" and I replied, "I'm letting go." My father said, "This family sticks together," and I asked, "Since when has that included me?" No one answered. That was the moment something inside me finally loosened. I stood up and said, "I'm not asking to be equal anymore," and my mother asked, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I'm stepping back." Jake rolled his eyes and said, "You're being dramatic," and I replied, "I'm being clear." I left without yelling, crying, or slamming doors. In the car, Maya said, "Did you say it?" and I said, "I stopped." She asked, "Stopped what?" and I replied, "Competing." On her couch I said, "They will never choose differently," and she said, Then you choose yourself. That felt terrifying and relieving at the same time. She handed me Ben's card and said, "Call him," and I asked, "Why?" She said, "Because resentment doesn't build stability, planning does." Ben listened quietly while I explained everything, and then he said, "You've been surviving, not deciding." I asked, "What's the difference?" and he replied, "Choice." He didn't shame me or rush me. He asked questions no one else ever had. He said, "You don't owe anyone access to your finances," and I felt my shoulders drop. I stopped answering my parents' calls immediately. When my mother said, "You're pulling away," I replied, "I'm grounding myself." My father said, "We're worried," and I answered, "I've been worried alone for years." Jake texted, "This is childish," and I didn't respond. The space felt strange, like silence after noise. Maya asked, "How does it feel?" and I said, "Like grief and relief together." She nodded and said, "That's what boundaries feel like at first." Ben helped me restructure everything: my budget, my goals, my expectations. I stopped measuring my worth against family approval. I stopped explaining my pain. I stopped waiting for fairness. When my parents invited me to dinner, I said no without apology. My mother said, "You're changing," and I replied, "I'm choosing." My father said, "We didn't mean to hurt you," and I answered, "Intent doesn't erase impact." They didn't argue. That silence told me more than words ever had. I noticed how much lighter my days felt without constant comparison. I slept better. I planned calmly. I stopped bracing for disappointment. Maya said, "You're not angry anymore," and I said, "I'm done explaining." Ben said, "You're building something solid," and I believed him. Jake struggled without immediate rescue, and I felt no satisfaction in it. Only distance. I realized how much energy I had wasted hoping to be treated equally. That hope had kept me stuck. Letting it go felt like freedom. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need to prove anything. I needed peace. And peace arrived when I stopped asking to be equal in a system that depended on imbalance. That was the real turning point. Not confrontation. Not revenge. Withdrawal. I chose myself quietly, firmly, without permission. And in that choice, I finally understood my worth had never been negotiable. The call came on a quiet afternoon, and I knew before answering that the balance had finally shifted. My mother said, "Emerson, we need your help," and I replied, "With what?" already calm. She hesitated and said, "Jake is in trouble again," and I waited without filling the space. My father took the phone and said, "We can't cover it this time," and I answered, "I understand." He paused and asked, "You do?" and I said, "I've understood for years." My mother said, "We thought maybe you could step in," and I replied, "I won't." Jake grabbed the phone and said, "Don't be like this," and I answered, "I'm being exactly who I am now." He scoffed and said, "You're really going to let me fail?" and I replied, "I'm letting you learn." My father said, "Family doesn't turn their back," and I asked, "When did family turn toward me?" No one answered. That silence told me everything. My mother whispered, "We didn't know it would get this bad," and I said, "It was bad for me too." She cried and said, "We were trying to protect him," and I replied, "You sacrificed me to do it." Jake said, "I just need one more chance," and I answered, "So did I." My father said, "You're being cold," and I replied, "I'm being consistent." I didn't explain my finances. I didn't justify my boundaries. I simply said, "I can't rescue anyone anymore." After the call, Maya asked, "Are you okay?" and I said, "I feel steady." She smiled and said, "That's different," and I nodded. Days passed, and I heard through relatives that my parents were struggling. They sold things. They argued. They stopped pretending. My father called again and said, "We didn't realize how much we relied on you," and I replied, "You relied without asking." My mother said, "We're listening now," and I answered, "That matters." They asked to meet, and I agreed on my terms. At the table my father said, "We failed you," and I said, "Yes." My mother said, "We didn't mean to," and I replied, "Intent doesn't erase impact." They didn't interrupt. They didn't correct me. They listened. That alone felt like closure. Jake didn't come. I wasn't surprised. I didn't need him there to finish this chapter. My father asked, "Can we rebuild?" And I said, slowly, honestly, without expectations. My mother reached for my hand, and this time I let her. I said, "I won't be the strong one anymore," and they nodded. When I left, the air felt lighter than it ever had. I walked home alone and smiled at the quiet. I built a life that didn't require survival mode. I paid bills without panic. I planned without fear. Maya said, "You look peaceful," and I replied, "I stopped bracing." Jake struggled without a cushion, and I felt no satisfaction in it. Only acceptance. He was learning late what I had learned early. My parents adjusted, awkwardly and painfully. They asked before assuming. They waited instead of demanding. They spoke carefully. I didn't rush forgiveness. I let trust grow slowly. One evening my mother asked, "Are you happy?" And I said, "I'm whole." She cried softly, and I didn't fix it for her. I had learned that lesson already. I didn't lose my family. I lost the role they gave me. The fixer. The dependable one. The one who never needed help. Losing that role gave me room to breathe. Room to choose. Room to rest. When I looked back, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt clarity. I survived without rescue, and now I lived without permission. That was the real change. Not watching someone fall, but finally standing without carrying anyone else's weight. As I closed my door that night, I said my name quietly. Emerson. Just Emerson. No role. No comparison. No debt to anyone else's comfort. And for the first time, that was enough.